First of all, I'm glad to be here and to talk about this very important topic in the context of what is happening in Chicago today. The experience in Chicago is not only important in terms of Chicago itself as a major city in the United States and in the world, but it does reflect something very basic about the politics and the economic development in the United States as a whole. And I want to talk about 4 points, which is part of the handout, just as an outline. I want to talk about, really first, I'm going to say a couple words about context, and then to talk about the Harold Washington campaign as such. And I might say that, in addition to my comments, I want to rely on you all for your memory, but also rely on the actual experience of Bennett Johnson here, who is a longtime activist and was very close personal friend of Harold Washington. You know, so that we can collectivize our thinking about this, and we certainly don't have any special knowledge other than what has come through our collective work during the campaign and subsequent reflections on what happened. So I want to also talk about the role of People's College, what we did during that time, which I think is very important to talk about in the context of a university setting like this, and then some general lessons of that struggle and what it might say to us today. So in talking about the campaign and talking about Harold, we have to talk about the man, the movement, and the campaign. Harold Washington was a very unique guy. I mean, that's first of all. He wasn't just another politician. He was born and bred in Chicago. His father was a lawyer, a minister, and a precinct captain. Now, you know, that's that triple play situation there put Harold right in the heart of not only the democratic machine, but in the heart of the political culture of the black community. And that meant that not only did he have knowledge of the networking of that community, but he had the rhetorical style of that community. His father was a preacher and a politician and a lawyer. And he was a well-liked guy. I mean, he was elected president of the student body at Roosevelt. And so he was somebody who was clearly going to play a role somehow in the leadership of his community. Then he was not only elected to the state legislature, but elected to Congress. So he had a long history as an elected official. And one of the interesting things about politics is a lot of young people sometimes think that you know, there can be a shooting star. You know, you can sort of get 7 league boots and just leap into somewhere. Harold represented somebody that really worked through a whole series of social relationships that enabled him to be the kind of guy that was, by acclaim, going to become the black candidate for mayor. But you got to put this in the context of the movements that existed. Remember that Harold is elected in the 80s, but the big breakthrough in Chicago was the 1960s. And I just want to mention that the school boycotts in 1963 and 64 were major in terms of the level of mobilization. See, this is, you know, I'm going to get to this point later when I say that one of the great lessons of this is that the masses make history. Now, you know, we could read that, you know, and be students and be academic and not tell us, well, we know that. But the point is that when you experience it, there's something special about what happened in the 1960s when, you know, millions of leaflets were produced out of Oakwood and Cottage Grove, the bank building there. And with cars coming from all over the city and bundles of them being put in the trunks of cars and people going out. And it closed down the school system in Chicago. This was major. It was major also because new leadership emerged. people who were on welfare, single moms, etc., became real leaders of the community. In other words, there was an infrastructure of social transformation that was going on. But also you had the existence, at least remnants, of the left. In other words, the Communist Party was still active. People like Ishmael Florey was a, he was a character. And his whole thing was democracy in the wards. That's what he's also come around and say to us, democracy in the wards. That's a real important point because he was talking about how to actually mobilize people on their own behalf. That's another point I want to make about consciousness and social forces in history. You know, there's this idea, again, something you can read. You know, ideas become material force when they are embraced by the consciousness of the masses of people and act accordingly. Well, yeah, but I mean to experience it. In other words, the 60s and Herald, 60s and then 20 years later Herald, were really festivals of the masses of people who woke up and began to fight in their own interest. But it was the movements that were there. There were black nationalist formations that were in play. There were trade unions that were still in play. Now I'm saying all that because that's really somewhat different than today. Because what we're talking about here is Chicago still represented an industrial city. And the black community was still had the impact of industrial workers. And what that means is there's a discipline to life. And not only a discipline to life in terms of get up, go to work, you know, but there was collectivity in that work. So you had a sense that together we could not only make these products, but together we might be able to transform the city in which we live. So the movements were really there from the 60s. The people were still around and were still in play. So Herald had all of that to rely upon. Now the campaign is very interesting because, first of all, this guy, Harold Washington, was an elected politician. A lot of people don't know is that he ran for the mayor's office in 1977 and came in 3rd place. But he was also testing the waters. See, we came up with something we call the Black Power batting average. And it's the denominator is the percent black of the voting age population. The numerator is the percent black of the political representation. And so when you get to 1, then what you've got is complete proportionate representation. And so if you look in the book, you'll see a way that we characterize 3 major stages of Chicago history in terms of black representation in city council. There was symbolic representation when there were 1 or 2 people elected. Then there was a machine where people began to develop, and then there was proportionate representation. And so when you look at that, the actual political struggle for power really led to a citywide struggle because one had, in fact, seen that black people had achieved proportionate representation in the city council. When Harold was thinking about running, the leadership of the black community wasn't interested, LaSalle Street and the business community wasn't interested, and the Democratic machine damn well wasn't interested. And, but Harold understood one thing that is important about Chicago politics. You have to learn how to count. Why? Because that's how the politics work. You not only have to count the votes, but you have to count the resources that you have in order to organize, mobilize, register, and get the vote to turn out. And so he tested this. And he started outside the political system. And what developed was a whole series of activities. One of the things that Bennett was involved in, and I don't know if he remembers this, but as a graduate student, I actually did a little survey for it. It was called Protest at the Polls. In other words, mobilizing people to express their political aspirations through the electoral process. Now, one of the interesting struggles with the left is that, of course, this electoral process is a part of the bourgeois state, and it's rigged, and in the end, you know, you're not going to get the social transformation you want. But one of the great lessons is that the masses of people are not left. And the question is really an epistemological question. How do people learn? Well, if you're a student, you learn mostly through books and through talking heads in classrooms. But as soon as you graduate, you suddenly learn that you have to relearn on the basis of the actual experience of the people that you're engaged with in the real world, whatever you do. Even if you go teach, I remember when I graduated, nobody taught me how to teach. I had to learn, they threw me in a classroom, and so the masses of people have to learn through their effort to vote about parties, about candidates, and perhaps about alternatives to the electoral system if, in fact, what they do doesn't result in what they want. But you can't just tell people that and then automatically say, okay, we're not going to do all the things that you think are irrelevant. And so that was the whole point. So Harold, coming through the political system, running for office in '77, but then he had a problem. And the problem was black people were not registering to vote, and if registered, were not turning out to vote. Now that's a problem. And so when people started to say, well, who's going to run for mayor? Now let me just say in passing that the only reason that became a real point is Daley was dead. Now this is a man who had been in office for 20 years. 4 times he ran unopposed. That's the kind of power this guy had in the city. Can you imagine? Unopposed. Daley. Well, he died. And of course, that just put the city into uproar. Why? Well, first of all, this is an ethnic city. Daley represents the 50 years of dominance by the Irish. The Poles, Puczynski and the Poles, they thought they were next. No, the Irish weren't having none of that. Then, of course, there were the Italians. So the white people were broken down in those 3 major ethnic groups. And so when Daley died, there was turmoil in the Democratic Party. And this gave the opening. So there was a struggle between Blandick and Byrne, and then the young Daley. They were struggling over, really, white people's votes. So here comes Harold. Then there were plebiscites, what were called plebiscites in the black community, and there were major attempts to rank the main, black candidates for mayor. Harold came to the top. Because he was well known, he had proven himself as a politician. He, in fact, was vice chair nationally of the American for Democratic Action, ADA, which is kind of a progressive group of Democrats, and had high ratings from all the progressive reviews of people in not only the state legislature but in Congress. So a black organization developed called the Task Force for Black Political Empowerment. Now this was really, again, an important thing because it brought together not only co-nationalists out of the Center for Inner City Studies and people who were still working with the Garvey movement, etc., but PUSH, Operation PUSH and Jesse Jackson. I mean, some 50 different organizations came together because people recognized that this was a possibility to transform the city. Latinos began to organize. White radicals began to organize, and it all coalesced around Harold Washington. But it wasn't just activists as such. There were, we outline in this book, 8 different struggles, or what we today call battlefronts, in which local leadership emerged, and in that individual struggle, whether it was around Cook County Hospital, to save Cook County Hospital, whether it was around the school system and the attempt by Byrne to replace 2 black representatives with 2 white women. So there were these 8 different struggles, and all the roads led to City Hall. And so these leaders began to be able to have real roots in the community to see that the possibility of this election campaign would have something to do with the issue that they were actively involved with. In other words, it wasn't an abstraction, they were actually involved in it. Now the Task Force for Black Political Empowerment would go to Harold and say, Harold, we want you to run, announce. And Harold would say, not enough people registered to vote. And then people would go out and register more people to vote. And kind of more registered to vote. And so he ramped it up to the point where now at record levels, his community was engaged in the political system. This carries over to the actual general election in terms of voter turnout, primary and the general election. The struggle for reform, which is what this was, had in it not only great promise, it had great limitations. One of the errors that was made by the movement is the movement liquidated itself and went into the City Hall. And the movement that didn't go into City Hall, this is basically white radicals and some of the progressive black middle-class professionals. But the black nationalists were essentially isolated. And because they wanted to support Harold, they didn't resist. In other words, the fight for reform became the only struggle in town. People went into the City Hall to support Harold. What that meant was that the autonomous struggle, right, wasn't there. Just a footnote, if you think about the Russian Revolution, the struggle against the Tsar, which was successful, the February Revolution, resulted in what? The Kerensky government. But the Kerensky government, that is the bourgeois Democrats, right? They were countered by the Soviets. In other words, the workers' councils were developing, and so there was really that unity and struggle so that the workers and the radicals had a base in which to hold the Kerensky government accountable. So there was an October Revolution where Kerensky is replaced by Lenin. There was no Soviet in Chicago. It was all Harold. Beautiful as he was. You know, and I swear this phrase, a revolution is a festival of the oppressed. You cannot imagine what it was like in Chicago in the 1980s. There was a blue button, and I'm sorry I didn't dig it out and bring it, because there were 1 million buttons that were distributed in Chicago, and people wore it as, you know, as a symbol of pride. And then the machine hired the El Rukans, the Blackstone Rangers, to start jumping on people on the south side. And so people would wear the blue button underneath their lapel. And they'd be standing on the L platform and look around and then flash that button at each other. And it was, but you know, it was a festival of the oppressed. In other words, I use this concept of spirit power. You know, when the masses of people get in motion, and there's a spirit power where people really are caught up in a consciousness of resistance. And when that happens, like in the civil rights movement when people started singing, or like in the labor movement when people started singing, and that collectivity that was expressed through those cultural forms, you can't stop that. You can't stop that. You know, in other words, it's not just a cerebral thing. It has to be translated into the cultural matrix that make people want to do it, even if they don't understand all the, you know, essays you all write about this and that. You know what I mean? It's a very important point about what struggle represents. And in the 1980s, it was incredible. But here's the other thing. Do not ever underestimate the role of the state. And the state means not only laws, it means the police and it means guns. Because when Daley died, for example, Wilson Frost was president pro tem of the city council. And he thought, this is a black man, and he thought, like in the past and like constitutional provisions would allow for, he was going to be the acting mayor. So Daley dies, he gathers up his stuff in his briefcase and everything and goes down to take over the mayor's office. He's met by a team of the armed Chicago police who say, no, you are not going to be the mayor. So go back to your office. So the deal they make is they make him in charge of the finance committee of the city council. And of course, what happens in the Latino community? Rudy Lozano is killed. In other words, violence is a natural part of the state. And when it came time for that transition, they were having none of it. Then, when Harold's elected, there is a split on the city council. 50 persons. Harold had 21 seats. The machine Democrats, led by a man by the name of Verdoliak, Eddie Verdoliak, he was in charge of the 29. So the first meeting of the city council, when it's clear that 29, we're not going to respect Harold, we're not going to do anything, Harold and the 21 got up and walked out. And from that point on, it was what in Chicago we call council wars. It was a straight-up throwdown struggle. And so the whole idea then, people began to learn that just because you voted somebody in did not mean that you were going to achieve what you thought you should achieve if this was some idealist notion of what a democracy was. You began to see the bare teeth of the capitalist state. Okay. Now, People's College was a collective, a black Marxist collective in Chicago. And we were actively engaged in both aspects of the Harold Washington campaign. We were inside and we were outside. And one of the things we did in the middle of the campaign is we called a conference. And there were some 300 or 400 people who showed up at the conference. And all of this is online. But this is the proceedings of the conference. And everybody that was engaged in the conference, trade unionists, all the ethnics, the students, black nationalists, black professionals, people like Richard Hatcher, who had been the mayor of Gary, everybody was involved in the conference. Now, we were told, why are you having a conference? Get out and vote. Get out in the neighborhoods, etc. We said, look, having a conference and bringing all these people together who hadn't ever been together. Suddenly, people began to discover what today we're calling 80-20. That is to say, the 80 was mainly, we mostly agree. And then there's 20 where we disagree. But one of the great weaknesses of the left is often we stress the 20 and remain irrelevant to the actual process of history. But whenever the left has been engaged in the process of changing history, the emphasis is on the 80. And that's what we actually discovered in this conference. But another thing we did in People's College is we said, let's document what happened. And so what we did is we read the newspapers. And I mean, we read the newspapers, the mainstream newspapers, the student newspapers, the community newspapers, etc. And just don't spend a lot of time with it, but just take a look at it and pass it along. This is also online. So the daily unfolding of the campaign is available through this kind of documentation. We also collected all of the documents from the left. And it's in another volume. The people who said that this was a bourgeois betrayal, Harold Washington was bourgeois betrayal, all the way to people who said Harold is the revolution. Full spectrum. Now, what is the point I'm making? The point I'm making is, particularly for people who are radical, is that people often forget that Marxism is social science. It's not religion, it's not ideology, it's social science. And the only way to study something is to actually get the evidence about that something in order to be able to reflect on it and understand the logic of it. And so that's why we put such effort into documenting the Harold Washington experience. Now think about it. How many people today are documenting the teacher struggle in Chicago? The speeches, the leaflets, the newspaper articles, the actual struggle that's going on, which is the leading trade union struggle in the city at the moment. That's your role. Young people and students, And radicals, that's the role, not just the ideological article that's written in the organ of the organization. Something more basic than that, something more fundamental than that. Anyway, that's the kind of thing that we try to do. Okay. Now, just to jump ahead to some lessons, because we want to have some Q&A. But first point is the ideological deduction versus politically based induction. It's really important for us. In other words, we were more interested in the idea of trying to study the movement and how people were learning and how people were self-organizing in order to transform the city than we were trying to develop positions that we then impose on the situation sort of as a top-down thinking kind of process. Again, this point about the masses make history. And another point that we discovered is that you had this book on page 142, we were looking at what we call the 5 faces of state power. Harold used to say, I got to be mayor for 20 years. And people would say, what the hell is he talking about? You know, well, if you look at this, you understand that to transform the state in Chicago, it takes a long time. One of the things the machine did was the machine did not rationalize City Hall. When you went in to deal with property, there was no rational organization of all the material. It wasn't alphabetized, for example. You had to know where the files were. And the people who worked there were apprenticing through the democratic machine to learn the system of information around which property was controlled in the city. One of the great things that Harold did was he brought in computers to the City Hall to rationalize it. But before that, you had to be born into a family that was allowed to come in to learn, oh, that file is on top of that thing, and that was over there on that shelf. You know, so it would take a long time. One of the interesting things that happened is that the machine had a large number of mayoral appointments, not civil service jobs, but mayoral appointments. Thousands of people. And so the movement was against that. And so as soon as Harold's elected, it was called the Shackman degree. As soon as Harold's elected, they, oh yes, that's a good idea. We won't have that number of people that can be appointed by the mayor. We'll make them all civil service jobs. So they cut from Harold the opportunity to put in people from the movement to transform all these city agencies, etc. Nevertheless, it remained a positive, important transformation that took place. So, also, we learned that class consciousness involves a social construction of memory with a combination of symbolism and substance. Because one of the important things about the struggle is that it's transgenerational. And new generations have to have the memory of the advances that have been made so that you stand on those advances and go further. And part of the problem, of course, is that the way the ruling class operates is you erase memory. And then people have to reinvent the wheel. And of course, that means lost time because the ruling class teaches their children, you know, the memory because they intend to rule forever. We also learned that social change is qualitative and quantitative. And we also learned there's a necessary connection between reform and revolution. My point is this. The only thing that ever takes place in the world is reform. Revolution is an idea. There's an old saying. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. But if you know where you're going, even though there might be a zig and a zag, you can still get back on track. That knowing where you're going is the revolutionary part of it. The actual reform struggle is the steps you take to get there. You know, I just came from an event, which is why I was late. And somebody said, we're trying to get rid of all prisons. And I leaned over and said to the person next to me, we're going to have prisons even after the revolution. You know, because we're going to have to lock somebody up. But the point is that that is a good idea. But if you were suddenly elected mayor or president, you couldn't just do a lot of things that run counter to where people's consciousness and what they believe, where they're at. So education, development, and so on is critical. We also learned that in Chicago, Black Latin unity is the key to any progressive motion in the city. And we're sitting here with one of my former students, Ramon Ocasio, and we have a film. And when Harold was at the University of Illinois giving the talk, Ramon stood up and asked a question about this very point. And that remains true today. Because even the white, what were called in Chicago then, I don't know what they call them now, but they were called lakefront liberals. When it came time to the general election, and this Hyde Parker who turned against Harold as a racist, named Epton, instead of them voting for progressive, they all voted with Epton, like all the rest of the white people did. So this question of how to get people not to vote in a racist manner, and of course we see this today when racism is the dominant theme in American politics today. What happened in North Dakota? Well, all the Native Americans can't vote, you know, because you need an address, and they use P.O. boxes, you know. Anyway, so that's it. So now what is to be done? Well, at a practical level, it's the battlefronts that are important. And the radicals and movement people have to form collectives and be at the battlefronts to educate the people who are emerging as leaders on their own behalf. That's one thing we learned in Chicago. It came out of the 60s, it came out of the 80s, and it's something that has to be rediscovered in the 21st century. The other thing is political education. There was a newspaper that came out of the North Side called All City Chicago News. It's Slim Coleman and others. It was very important. But there were other papers. I mean, even the Defender had a role to play in this, as you'll see from these clips. So there's constant political education in the community. But for that matter, even Muhammad Speaks was important. So now today, with the web and the internet, it's a real serious question about how to educate the masses of people. Is the internet sufficient? Who's online? And what is the potential role of print publications in terms of educating and communicating with the masses of people? This is a question that I think is before us. And lastly, I think, is to really help the youth understand that it's a protracted struggle. You know, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Black Power movement and its impact in the 67, Wall of Respect, 68, 69, so on, Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, etc. To what extent are young people today understanding that we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of what you all are doing right now? And if you know that, like the AACM says, we are ancient to the future. If we know that, then what would we do? How would we document what's going on so that subsequent generations will be able to remember and have the memory of our advances? So those are my comments, and let's have a conversation.
Thank you, Professor. So yeah, we'll open up the Q&A. Does anyone have any?
Yeah, I guess I could start. I'm curious to hear a bit about the legacy of the old left for this work that you're describing, and to what extent do you think, under the guidance and tutelage of older figures who have been part of the Popular Front, you were basically applying that perspective to new historical and political conditions? And to what extent do you think were there any innovations or developments that broke or maybe advanced beyond the Popular Front perspective? How do you see the 80s moment, the 70s and 80s moment, kind of in dialogue with that earlier 30s, 40s moment?
What we're talking about here is the concept of unite the many to defeat the few. And it depends on how you define the many. You know, you could say, well, one way to define the many is all the workers. You know, so I have a working class base. Another way to define is in terms of how it has historically been defined in terms of the Black liberation movement, which is workers and middle class people and everybody else, because the common experience of racism, et cetera, united a lot of people in a common struggle. In Chicago, one of the interesting things is that the left had a real base in the trade union movement. So the people like Tim Black, for instance, and Ishmael Flory. Tim Black was a trade unionist who came out working with A. Philip Randolph and others. And then, and Charlie Hayes, who was subsequently elected to Congress, was one of the rare, I think he was the first active trade unionist elected to Congress in the United States. And then Ishmael Flory was an activist in the Communist Party. Margaret Burroughs. And you know, on the one hand, we don't know who was actually a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. But what we do know is that that generation that came out of the Depression era and the struggle against fascism in World War II, they didn't make a sharp distinction between the struggles for social democracy and whether you were on the left or you were a part of what kind of party. What happened is a whole new generation of young people were educated. And one of the interesting things is that a large number of black people who were students at the University of Chicago were educated by Ishmael Flory and other people who were on the left. In fact, we used to meet at Chicago Theological Seminary. And what's interesting is that the people who met there were not only people like Bob Rhodes and Harold Rogers and people, Tony Montero, who were close to the CP. There were also people who were more on the nationalist side. So Barbara Sizemore, Anderson Thompson, etc. And we all met together. And one of the interesting things is that people like Bob Rhodes, who was kind of a political economist, he would teach people how to read the business section of the newspaper. You know, so we sit there reading the Financial Times. You know, now think about how many people who consider themselves progressive actually study the information that the ruling class shares with each other. You know, we can peek over their shoulder and see what they're saying to each other, as opposed to remaining in our comfort zone of reading whatever column you're reading and whatever organ of whatever organization you're part of. So there was a legacy through education, and because there was a struggle that came out of the 60s in terms of the civil rights movement turning into the Black liberation movement, and then the way the Panthers, for example, were replicated in every ethnic group. So we have the Young Lords, and you know, Chicago's very important in all that. You have a context, really, for a tremendous unity that develops. This is something we sort of lack today. Now, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, what we experience now is a movement delinked from that history. So the three women who formed Black Lives Matter and the subsequent spontaneous attraction to it lacked that education and rootedness in the 30s and 60s that came from a left perspective that had a critique of capitalism, etc. And then secondly, what you've got is we live in an NGO moment. And so back then, self-determination meant if you're going to have a movement, you're going to have people in your community have to fund it. Because nobody else was going to fund it. But today you've got foundations and NGOs that, so they're young people who come out of college and they become trainers of the trainers. and they're making $60,000 or $80,000, and they're traveling around and they stay in hotels. They're not staying on people's couches or sleeping on sleeping bags in the basement of churches anymore. And so when I go to sometimes to young people who say this and that, and who's going to pay for it? You know. And so this is a different moment. And they learned. They learned. So people are not really allowed to develop. Even young people, the immigrants, the United We Dream. They had a conference. These are a network of young people who were struggling around the immigration rights, etc. They had a conference and they were talking way up in the 6 figures for their conference. And they were raising money and they actually got it. But when you are attached, then how much can you think out of the box? That's really a question. Now, look, I'd be the last one to say don't take the money. You know. But the question is, what does the money, how does it impact you? And so, now historically the left had global money. They had global support. There is no global support today. That's another big, you know, and the support was not only monetary, it was political and moral. And so you had writers like Richard Wright, for example. Richard Wright would not have been the kind of global figure had it not been for the support of the Soviet Union and East Germany. That's very important. And we don't have that today. What we have today is 20th century socialism, which was essentially about industrialization. Just like there was capitalist industrialization, there was socialist industrialization. Now, even countries like China and Cuba are now having to change to reorient themselves to the global economy. And then the struggle there is to preserve what advances were made for the new stage of history in which we exist. And that's the whole point about Chicago. It used to be an industrial city. It's turning into a different kind of city now. And so we've got to rethink what are the social forces that can coalesce to create the kind of project that we need. Now, that doesn't mean that the struggles that are going on. I mean, look, there's a dude in the city council, Carlos, what's his last name?
Ramirez Rosa.
Yes. Right? I believe that we have to support the people who are struggling. So I don't know about you all, but I brought a check. I'm giving a check to support Carlos. You know. Now maybe you can pass out some leaflets. Now, is Carlos going to make a revolution? No. But is Carlos the best shot we got at the moment to carry the banner of struggle? Yes. In other words, politics is real. You know, the real world. And we supported Harold. And then I spoke about Harold, beyond Harold. If you read this, the concluding panel with Richard Hatcher, and I was in the concluding panel, you know, it was critical of Harold, etc. But we put everything we had into supporting Harold to get him elected. You know. That's how I feel about my mom. You know. I mean, I support her 100%. You know, but, you know, you have to go beyond those things. You know. She didn't want me to do a lot of things. She didn't want me to go to the Mississippi Summer Project. She thought I would die. You know, and I had to, you know, tell her, you know, that I had to go. So, you know, what do you think?
What do I think about?
Whatever.
Well, I'm interested in the NGO movement because it's really difficult. So I, you know, I grew up in New York and tried to be politically active, and you know, worked in the Working Families Party offices and Center for Popular Democracy and all these things, which are absolutely fun. I mean, Working Families is a party by unions, but even maybe unions have changed. Absolutely, it feels like the divorce of the funding from the actual community, like changes the work, changes the mindset, makes it more. Well, I mean, I don't know if it was like this. Was it like this? This feeling of, you know, you join an organization and you start prescribing things for communities, rather than, you know, you join a community and then the community prescribing things for politics.
Well, that is the, when we first started, when People's College in Nashville, Tennessee, we first started, it was students and faculty and some people in the community, right? And we were, you know, sort of a left kind of group, and we were embracing the idea of to the factories. And so a group of the students went and got jobs in this shoe factory and tried to write leaflets. And nobody was interested in these leaflets. And finally, my sister, that's her right there, she was in a place where they sold these dynamite fish sandwiches. And the woman that she was engaged with, right, either worked in the plant or had family in the plant. And the workers took over the leaflets and wrote the leaflets, and then suddenly people were interested. So that really makes the point that the magic is to serve the people and to be patient enough to, first of all, understand their consciousness and their objectivity. And there's a contradiction there. Their workers are getting screwed. Their consciousness might not be aligned with that. And you have to work through that, and you have to be patient, and that's why it's a long march. It's a long journey toward that level of consciousness. But, and there's an art to this. There are those moments where a leap occurs. And so when we were talking about the school boycotts, there was a leap of consciousness. When we were talking about Harold, there was a leap of consciousness. I mean, you've got to look at some of the videos of the community, etc. And an example I'll give you is Harold was a word master. He not only had that rhetorical thing in church, he had a hell of a vocabulary. So there were times when he would start talking and use the big words, polysyllabic words, and the people who didn't understand what he was saying would say, "Get him, Harold, get him." You know, in other words, they were feeling Harold. They knew he was their man, you know. And so that's another thing, the question of trust. So sinking deep roots and getting trust. I mean, People's College, when we go into a place, they say, well, here comes some young people. I know y'all going to be here for a while and then you'll leave. And we're here forever. So when you stay, same with SNCC. SNCC came, they said, well, you know, we've seen people come, you know, you're going to mess around with us and then you leave and we're going to catch more hell. SNCC stayed. And so then when they go to the Atlantic City Democratic Convention, and King and others start to talk about the deal that was made, you know, voice no vote for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and Fannie Lou Hamer stood up and said, we really respect you, Dr. King, but we came with them and we're going to leave with them, talking about SNCC, to refuse that kind of deal. So, because they trusted, they walked the walk. And so, you know, it's a long-term process. But I mean, I feel what you're saying. You know, it's really important. This notion of the masses make history. I mean, it's really hard to
Especially when they vote for Cuomo.
Look, they voted for George Wallace. They voted for Trump. I mean, you know, you can't get further down than that. You know, but what we have is the fact that their objectivity. So, for example, if they continue to win Congress and they attack Social Security and Medicare, how many people are going to say, it's okay if my mama can't get no health care? But a lot of these people say, I'm against big government, but don't touch my Social Security. So we've got the objective, you know, to use to help people to understand. But you got to overcome racism. You know, which is deep, you know, because that's how the game is going down. Whether it's the immigrants, the issue at the border, or whether it's the Muslims, or, you know, whether it's the speech he just gave where he said, black people ought to vote for Republicans because the unemployment thing is so low. And oh, by the way, they should also support Robert E. Lee as a great American hero. said this in the same paragraph. In the speech, I think it was in Mississippi. Now you know. I mean, so anyway, that's clear who he is. And then this brown shirt situation of these violent youth that are spreading the country is another. What do you think?
Of the brown shirts or the?
No, just in general.
All right, I guess I have a. Come back to me. I gotta reformulate it.
Okay.
My thought.
Okay. What do you think?
What do I think? I guess I was wondering if you could go back to, like, one thing that stuck out to me during your initial remarks was the question of how people learn. And you were talking about how there was a certain sort of, like, education that people got through voting leading up to the Harold Washington moment. And that through learning, through voting, like, they kind of necessarily realized that voting only gets so far, like, in terms of, like, political achievement, and, you know, organizing around certain, like, wanting to meet certain goals for political change. So, yeah, I was just wondering if you could, like, elaborate on, like, how, to what extent do you think, like, voting remains important in terms of, like, political education for the masses? And has that changed since the Harold Washington moment? And, yeah, just anything else related to that?
See, one of the interesting things about theory is that you can use it. It really is important. So, for example, there's a contradiction between freedom and necessity. That's an interesting philosophical issue. And a lot of people think the idealist notion that freedom is universal and dominant. And the materialist approach is that necessity is is principle. For example, I can have the idea I want to get out of this room. But the material reality is there are only so many doors. Now you could say, okay, there's a window, there are walls. I don't have the tools to get through the walls. And I'd rather go through the doors than the windows. What am I talking about? I'm talking about my ideas have to come into correspondence with the necessary, with the reality of life, and make choices. So when it comes to voting, the issue that we have to face is, okay, what are the options? Okay? All right, we could form an army, we could arm ourselves, and we could take over the government. Yeah, we could, but I don't think that's something that's on the agenda this week or this year, right? So we have to then say, okay, well, what can we do to begin to mobilize people in their own interest so that they can become not only conscious of their interests, but better organized. And I'm talking about that on a block-to-block level, you know, neighbor to neighbor, community level, about the reality of life, you know. And so the voting issue today is about every policy question that the Republicans are attacking. And, you know, everybody's interested in, you know, all the surveys, health care. You know, the American public is for the most positive and progressive policy toward health care. You know, however it's put, you know. The majority of people in the country are for peace and diplomacy. They're not for war. So, in pursuing those policy concerns, then suddenly people can begin to learn who are our friends and who are our enemies. Who's against these things. And, you know, I believe that people can only lie so much. You know, what's that old saying? You can lie to some of the people some of the times, you can't lie, you know, all the people all the time. We have to base ourselves on that. And I think that that's why I was saying Carlos and other people who are saying the truth. Even when it's 49-1. Because then it'll be 48-2. And Harold proved it could be 29-21. You know, I mean, again, counting. you know, you can actually, we can, see, we can make change. You have to believe that. You have to, I agree with Jesse, people alive. But, you know, the bottom line here is that what is possible right now? That is the ultimate thing about change. And Harold, you know, represented an elite. Nobody thought a black man could be the mayor of Chicago.
But can a black woman be?
That's the issue today, isn't it, Ms. Prankwinkle? That is the issue. Now, how many people would even think a black woman could be the, you know? And a lot of people would say, well, she's just a Democrat, she's, you know. But then the question you have to, this is the real thing, is, do you want Daley? I mean, you know, this is real. It's not imaginary, it's not abstract. But here's the other thing. The day after she's elected, are you able to struggle against her? You know, it's just like saying a 1,000-mile journey begins with a single step. So you can take a step, you gotta take another step. Yeah.
I guess just to put a finer point on my question, like, do you think, well, both in the Harold Washington moment and today, and you can answer this differently for either, does voting create a consciousness within workers and, you know, community members that points to a necessity for change beyond changes that are possible in electoral politics?
No, voting doesn't do it. Voting, once you vote, then suddenly you are participating in this bourgeois democratic process.
Right.
And you can end up with the idea that the system is able to transform itself. Right? You can assume, you can have that idea. But I think the voting is a way of taking a policy position. But it's only by having an organization that's outside of the state can that voting experience be the basis for additional learning. In other words, the voting itself is not going to be the basis of learning. It's the way in which we can interpret the results of the election, and we can continue to struggle. Because when I said struggle against Preckwinkle, what I'm talking about is Preckwinkle is going to have to make deals with LaSalle Street. She's going to have to make deals with people of power. And we're going to have to put pressure on her and struggle to get her to keep moving in a progressive manner. And she's going to be trying to tell us about the necessity to go along, just like when Harold formed his transition team, the people who got him those votes, the outsiders, the Task Force for Black Political Empowerment, the trade union movement, they were nowhere to be seen. His transition team were the people of power in the city, because he was negotiating with power in the city. Preckwinkle is going to be the same way. And it's only by us having the power based in the communities and based in the movements that we'll continue to get progressive policies. And in the end, we may have to elect somebody more progressive than her. But right now, it's Daley versus her.
I've got
Okay.
mine more carefully formulated. It actually, I think, bounces off of Stephanie's question. So you conceptualized of the Harold Washington campaign and the radicals who were involved in that as like a step in the long march towards, you know, towards making the connection between reform and revolution. We're right now in a moment where it seems like we've maybe taken a step forward and 2 steps back, in that the left groups, like the, you know, the sectarians, as well as those who are trying to create some kind of popular front behind Bernie Sanders, behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, are learning even less from your generation than yours did from the generation of the 30s and 40s in the popular front then. I suppose, I know we're here in this room right now, but what do you consider the relationship, you know, between our generations to be, and how we've been carrying on or failing that legacy?
How do you feel about it?
I feel like don't know.
Okay, how do you feel about it?
About it.
What he said? Was he,
I mean, I think there's a lot that I find difficult to accept about your characterization of how politics are supposed to happen in light of what has happened since then. In other words, the fact that the election of Washington actually didn't produce a growth or actually a development in black politics that actually led anywhere. You said that that what you thought was the decisive factor is knowing the difference between reform as where you are and knowing where you're going. But it doesn't seem like we've actually gotten anywhere in the last 30, 40 years. Certainly when I look at the election next year, the mayoral election, and you point to Periwinkle as like the viable candidate, or point to Carlos Rosa as the person that can get us somewhere. I think of Amara Enya, who just got put up by Chance the Rapper as that he just endorsed her, which was supposed to be a big thing. And at her own conference, they were asking her why she was running when Lori Lightfoot is the more viable candidate. So now we're talking about 3 black women that are competing with each other as viable candidates, and each of them are actually opposing each other on the basis of like one or another actually saying they're more progressive or have a better chance of winning. And Chan's actually saying stuff like, actually it doesn't matter whether she wins, this is the candidate that will actually represent something for the community that they can get behind, right? That even if she loses, which she might, that she's what's necessary, and that's more important than merely conceding ground, right? And so, like, I don't know what you think about these factors, along with the fact that the 1980s, especially in Chicago, were a rapid moment in this sort of like onset of neoliberalism in Chicago, where you saw not only in the Washington years the population drop, and much of that population being people with jobs leaving the city, and white people at that, but you saw like the disintegration of social services that, you know, characterize everything since the 70s, where what you're talking about in terms of like community organizing and how that's been replaced with these like large institutions that are like funded, these NGOs, that can't be divorced from the fact that we live in a different form of social organization. And I don't know how you understand that change, or whether you think a different form of politics might be necessitated by it.
well, let's start by talking about whether Harold made a difference. See, if you put yourself in the context and you look at the world from the point of view of the working class, from the point of view of the neighborhoods, what was accomplished? Well, first of all, he democratized the city budget so that the allocations for each ward were more equitable. So that, for example, streets and sanitation was more universally active in all the wards. That was profound. And that was a structural transformation of the racist class situation that had existed under Daley.
But now you just have neighborhood rackets. So now the people that got put into office by his political education program, the people like Gutierrez and Chuy Garcia are running individual like ward rackets and presented within their own communities. So now you have like structural, I don't know.
Here's the interesting thing about the question of reform.
Okay.
Even a $15 an hour struggle is a renegotiation of the terms of your exploitation. And by the time you get to $15 an hour, it's not, you know, because they always put it out a year, 2 years, or 5 years, or whatever it is. By the time you get it, you know, it's the equivalent of having $10. So, okay. But to assume that that means that the struggle leads nowhere is a position that negates the possibility of struggle. Because I would argue there is absolutely no instance in the history of almost any society that isn't the history of reform struggles in which people fight and they fail, and they fight again and they fail again until they fight on to victory. And by that I mean a leap. And even the leaps that take place have contradictions within them and often turn into their opposites. That's what happened to 20th century socialism. So one can argue, using your logic, that 20th century socialism didn't really take us where we wanted to go, and therefore, what the hell? Why engage in it? When in fact, that would be taking ourselves out of human history. Human history is the actual struggle to learn from all the zigs and zags and setbacks. So when I said this question of in the words, then you say, well, what about Louis and his machine? You're assuming that that doesn't create its opposite. And that's really a fundamental understanding of dialectics. Of course he's created a machine, but there are people who are against that machine. And that dialectic is always going to emerge in every situation. And that's what the protracted struggle is always about. There's always a motion and a counter motion, and the struggle takes place. And even when that's resolved, the struggle isn't over, it continues. So for example, out of every communist party that is currently in motion, there's a struggle within that party over the capitalist rotors who want to say that, along with Deng Xiaoping, you know, that what we have to do is have market socialism, or in other words, let's have a little capitalism in order to advance our societies. Well, that doesn't mean that everybody submits to that. So in China today, you have the greatest trade union strikes in the history of any society in the world going on. So, you know, my point is that the struggle takes place. And right now, if you say that you shouldn't be in the electoral struggle, then fine. What battlefront could you be on that doesn't have policy connected to it, that is public policy? And that's where people learn, is through the struggle. Not to submit, but to struggle. And that's my whole point about Preckwinkle. Right now, or Harold, right? There were a whole list of people who they said we could have as candidates for mayor, Jussie being one. Well, Jussie did be a candidate for mayor, but he certainly did what? Vaulted himself as candidate for president. Even that struggle, you know, was an advance in the sense that trade unions and the black church became more involved in actively pushing forward progressive programs of change. But I would not in any way, you know, strategically, not in the reform struggle, but in my strategic thinking, this question of these reform Democrats or Jussie or any of these people are going to take us anywhere we really want to go. But in the motion of the moment, they represent the only alternative. To sit out when the masses of people are potentially involved, you suddenly then say, I don't want to be a teacher. This is back to the epistemological point. I don't want to be a teacher of the masses of people. So that if the left says, well, we're going to set up a study group on state and revolution, right? And so those 6 people, whoever they are, probably your relatives and friends, you get together. And over here, there's a potential to have thousands of people, which went through political education classes around the Harold Washington campaign, engaged in a discussion of the nature of the state and the nature of voting, etc. What would you do? Would you want to swim among the masses of people, or would you want to be with a small, tiny collective? Or would you understand the necessary connection between the two? Because of course, I want you to study state and revolution, but I don't want you to, as a matter of principle, think you shouldn't be involved in the historical moment of the times in which you live. That's really my point. Yeah.
Yes, I want to raise maybe a point that is probably familiar because we've been talking about these things for a few years now, but like the way I'm able to understand the logic of what you're saying is, I suppose, on the premises of the Marxism of the Second International. Like, to the extent that I actually agree with a lot of your formulations, even though I'm not necessarily doing what you're suggesting right now in my life, I think it should be done, and I might do it someday. I think that model is, in a way, more propitious, or I see that as more adequate to the aim of kind of building power on the left, building a political party for socialism. Because I guess, you know, for example, when you talk about, you know, this Marxist concept of people learning through struggle, right? My understanding is that that was formulated at a time, you know, looking back to the 1830s, 1840s, where independent proletarian socialist party politics had not really come into existence. And so you could have someone like Rosa Luxemburg, for example, looking back, I believe, in the late 1890s or early 1900s, and celebrating the legacy of Ferdinand Lassalle, saying, you know, certainly he wasn't a Marxist, this isn't a perfect exemplar, but he grasped this essential point, right, the kind of political independence of the working class movement for socialism. And, you know, certainly I think Engels was true to the legacy of Marx and Engels at the end of his life when he helps to found and guide the Second International on this basis, right? So that everything you're talking about, you know, theory gripping the masses not only in terms of, you know, understanding of arcane text, but singing and, you know, kind of more mass popular forms of participation and celebration. Like the Second International did all of that. It contained all of that, including here in the United States. You know, you had a party that was tens of thousands of people strong, cut across, you know, cultural, subcultural divides, was very, you know, very sort of representative of the population, and had people undertaking the sort of work that you're talking about. So I guess like when I think of Joseph's comment about, you know, we seem to be left with less of a legacy, you know, as a result of the 80s, as a result of the politics that led, for example, to the Harold Washington campaign. I think maybe part of his point is that, you know, we could imagine things hypothetically having turned out differently if the model the New Left followed had been one of that, you know, sort of taking a lot of your practical points, but prosecuting them on the basis of an independent political party for socialism, rather than following the Popular Front model of doing that in and through the Democratic Party. And so I think that's what some in our generation, certainly not everyone, but some in our generation, especially I think those who are really, you know, acutely sensitive to the legacy of Marxism, are really wrestling with that question of that legacy of the New Left, in a way actually being very consistent with what's happening today. I think, you know, there are political conversations going on, you know, around these questions. So I guess maybe that would be my question, like why do you think you and many of your generation decided not to do that? Why did you decide not to do that and kind of proceed with the practical insights that you're offering, but on the basis of this earlier model of an independent political party?
No, I don't think you read the history correctly at all. I think that what happened is much more that the 60 generation and move to the left were really very much Third International. In other words, the real question for a lot of people was, because the movement essentially was experiencing defeat, assassinations, and so on, that people immediately thought that the next step was a revolutionary party modeled after a Leninist party. That was out of SDS. There were people out of SNCC. There were people out of League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Black Panther Party. And so there was a search for a vanguard party. And so rather than, like in Europe, for example, the Albanians, I know this is going to sound a little strange, but anyway, we're having this kind of discussion. The Albanians had the same situation. They had a lot of collectives, etc., and they couldn't unite, but they were facing fascism. And so the leaders of the organizations were pushed aside, and the second level leadership formed a party. Well, we didn't have that. So that the October League, it's, you know, these various parties, RCP, et cetera, and the Trots, and so forth, everybody started. It was like when the party was formed in this country and the Comintern had the sense of people that slapped some people upside the head and say unite. Well, that didn't happen, and so there was a lot of this breakdown, fracturing that occurred. Had people done what the Germans did, out of '68, when the movement of the students around the world, what the Germans did was, among other things, they went into public school teaching. And out of that came the Green Party in Germany. And that the Greens then got a position in the parliament, in the Bundestag. And they remain there today. That's the legacy. But we didn't have that. What we had were people like Julian Bond and others who went into electoral politics, but it was then divorced from their mass base. And so the Democratic gains in the South. Now remember, when you say the South, what are you talking about? You're talking about fascism. racial domination, with the state murdering people. We could bigger over words. Well, is it fascism or is it something else? I'm talking about something cold-blooded and real. So when those people started registering to vote and got to be elected as sheriff or on the city council or the county board or etc., those were life-saving developments. And so a lot of people in the North were acting like, well, that was necessary for people to do that. Now, did that make a revolution? No. But did that advance the struggle in the South? Yes. And you can explain it partly by the fact that in the 50s, the CP left the South and changed its line over the national question. And therefore, people were left on their own. And so it took people like SNCC, etc., to regroup the indigenous leaders that were there fighting all along against lynching, lynch mobs, etc. So we're having to go back. I think, just my own personal view is, revolutionary organization is going to be necessary because of who we're up against. But my years of struggle had taught me that if you're going into a gang fight, you better get a gang. And, the people are the gang. I remember when I went down to Atlanta to join the SNCC mobilization for the Mississippi Summer Project. And I, flew into Atlanta and I get there to Hunter Street and I walk up and I see two groups of people that represent SNCC. There was Julian Bond and Worth Long and some other people, the college kids. Then I saw the Negroes from Mississippi who had these big fros and these big cake cutter things, and big combs in their hair, and, look wild, and, and I had to charge. I had to choose. Now, who do you think I went to connect with? I went where there was likely to be a war, a gang, a group of people who were going to fight. So I went with the brothers from Mississippi. I hooked up with Julian and them later, but I went with the dudes who looked like I came down to join them. Because they're the ones that had been facing what had been going on. See, I'm like this brother Gator here, this brother that came late. Now, he works with ex-offenders and gang members. Now, who are they? They're working class youths that are suffering under the weight of this capitalist system. And it's them that have to become transformed in their consciousness to get involved if we're ever going to have a real struggle in this country. It's really just like the Christians talk about, the last have to be first. Isn't that a Christian concept? It's similar to that. But to get the trust of those brothers and to get them not to deal with you like you're a mark, which is natural, if I'm hungry and you come up and you look like you got some money, I want to try to move the money from your pocket to my pocket. That's natural. But you have to work with them. And then suddenly, when they become in the leadership, they're going to have much deeper concepts than you about their experience and about the truth of their reality. That's really the point I'm trying to make. Theory can only take you so far if you're not in the actual reality of the class experience. Yeah.
I mean, does that apply to something like the Blackstone Rangers? And when was it too late? When they became Alrukans or before that?
No, but I'm not talking about you see, there's this idea that the Alrukans could become a progressive force.
That they had in
I'm
the
not
60s.
talking about that. I'm not talking about that.
Okay.
I mean, in other words, Mao discovered that, the bandit gangs, the concept of the lumpen. Any social force that becomes predatory on the society. I'm talking about these people who are the victims. And when you see them as victims, then the false consciousness of their gangsterhood, right, is no different than the middle class illusion that going to the University of Chicago means you can become part of the society and lead a dynamite life. Again, false consciousness. That's the point. There are lots of false consciousness. And when you break through that and you get to the class reality, the objective reality of their lives, then suddenly you discover they're working class kids that have been fucked around by a poor educational system, by a broken family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the realities that I'm talking about. And when they become conscious of what their own life has been, and conscious of the system that created it, not that their mama was this because she was on drugs, or my father left and he's an asshole. You know, there's all of that that's in people's consciousness. But you can get beyond that. You can actually see the way the system has treated you and everybody else in your community. That's the importance of people like George Jackson. And the people in the prison movement who began to educate people around their objective reality. And then suddenly, all the prisoners. So Attica becomes then the what? Where race, gender, generation, all that was pushed aside when they went up against what? The cold-blooded arm of the state and Rockefeller. And to me, that's what we're talking about. How do we get the masses of people to understand the objective reality of their lives and to organize themselves in such a way that they can transform the society? That is our task. And in the meantime, if we can sing with them and dance with them and get them to have a celebration of little advances. I was for the Arab Spring, but it wasn't going to create no revolution. But it was a change. It was a way of expressing resistance. Anyway, what do you think about all this?
Well, what took my attention was the comment you mentioned about the current generation being disconnected from the movements that came before. And I'm wondering how should we, what do you recommend that this current generation do differently?
Well, one of the interesting things is a lot of old heads are desperately looking for somebody to talk to. Because, you can feel like you're not respected. Nobody wants to hear what happened. And I think that that'd be one place to start, is to get people to just describe their lives and what happened, and with respect. And understand that they are not going to say what is truth and what you should believe in exactly what they say. That's not what I'm talking about. Because what I'm talking about is the more you listen to people, the more you can generalize and understand even the differences among your own peers. So that'd be one thing. And I think a second thing is, and this is something we did, is you have to study real hard. And when we came along, when I say that we were learning from, no. The left literature of the actual movement, we discovered in libraries and in special collections. And we would go and we would Xerox them. And sometimes you get a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, you could hardly read it. And but then eventually these things start getting reprinted and so forth. But we were really serious about this. And so we had to dig into the archives and pull this information out. We even had to go and get some people who had, the old communists, they got drunk. The new communists got high. So we had to go find Harry Haywood, who was in Mexico drunk, and bring him out, sober him up, and he eventually got with the young people in the October League and the CPML, and eventually wrote the book about his life and about so-and-so. So I think that that's another thing. But also I think, and this is my own personal experience, is that I was here at the University of Chicago reading, what they were assigning and reading other things, and working my way through Marx and Durkheim and Weber and so forth. But then I took that not only the content of that, but the style of that into the movement. And so, I more respected the movement. And so I was trying to bring professional excellence to that than professional excellence on campus and then some other kind of attitude and whatever in the community. And so this kind of work this kind of documentation and this kind of proceedings and so forth and so on, this wasn't the standard that everybody was using. But, we saw Milton Friedman in the econ department. And we saw that brother team. One brother was the head of the South Shore Commission and the other guy became provost. The Levy brothers. We saw the restricted covenants that the university had engendered east of Lake Park, in East Hyde Park. And we went up against all of that. And so we had to go up against them, And the community began to respect us for that reason. Just like I said, they respected Harold's vocabulary. They didn't understand what he was saying, but they knew it was in their interest, so they really dug it. I think that, but, and here's the big but, when state socialism became essentially, when state ceased to be a leader of any big faction of the left generally, the good aspect of that is that we had to think for ourselves. I remember we were with the Chinese. Foreign language press, we were reading Peking Review. That was what we read. And then people started trying to read Fidel. And, but Fidel would talk for hours and hours. Anyway, so the Cubans. But now we have to think for ourselves. That means we have to go back to the basics. That's why I was saying Marxism is social science. In other words, what I would say about any differences we have, like, for example, take this election. Right? I said some things, you said some things, other people might say some things. Where's the evidence that we can all study? Because if we are anywhere near materialism, if we read the text, we get the data, we got to come to some general view, 80-20. Seems to me that's if we're all trying to get to the same place. What are we trying to get to? Any battlefront. I'm for women's liberation. I'm for gay liberation. I'm for workers' liberation. I'm for liberation of everybody. But if somebody says that their liberation is more important than somebody else's, I got a problem with that. The way we used to say it is, say this is a dentist office. All y'all are waiting on to go to the dentist. And I walk in and I say, look, my tooth really hurts. Would you mind if I go next? What do you think people in this room would say? Take a number and sit down. That's a democratic thing. So, okay, so we can't elevate one pain over another pain. No hierarchy of pain. We're all in here to see the dentist. We all want to overthrow the evil capitalist system, and Trump should not be elected to a second term. And the Republicans should not run Congress after the midterms. I think I'm assuming we all agree with that. How can you not agree with that? What do you think?
I'm curious. So I take your point about paying attention to the actually existing movement at the time, and it's certainly easier in retrospect to give criticism. But I'm curious about what the 20 thought. For example, you give this divide of the 80-20, and if our task then now is educating ourselves in a rigorous way, what are some of the critiques you had of Harold that, looking back, is something that you would say needed to be improved for the future?
Well, the way I would put it is I did not expect Harold to be a revolutionary. So I don't have that kind of critique. My critique is much more a critique of the movement than a critique of Harold. It seemed to me that, for example, when Harold died, there was a line at City Hall that was around City Hall and all the way down the block. You know, people were in mourning. And I was sorry that we were not in a van with a mimeograph machine running off information that could have spoken at that moment to people about, you know, it's sort of like what Che Guevara said, when a comrade dies, you mourn long enough to reload your rifle and sharpen the machete, you know. So it was that kind of moment. There was a moment. The same thing happened when Fred Hampton was killed. There was a moment. There was silence in the city, etc. And that was a moment to do something. And we just weren't able to do it. Harold died, same thing. And so, and like I said, I mean, Slim and them went into City Hall, Slim Coleman. One comrade, and they're most advanced cadre. One comrade became a speechwriter for Harold. Slim was caught up in the fact that he had IDs and he could go in and out of City Hall and this and that and this and that. The real task was to build outside. And that's exactly this whole point about the strategic versus the tactical, or the reform and the revolution. And so, because Harold was, I mean, he was everything you'd want a social democrat to be. So I really, again, like I say, I really would hesitate to criticize him because I think that he realized who he was. It's sort of like Martin Luther King. It's sort of like Malcolm. These are historical figures that maximized who they were. And you know, like you could say, well, Malcolm should have stayed out of the country and he shouldn't have been assassinated. You know, or King should have done this, should have done that. They maximized. I hate this idea that people failed in history. It's so easy to go back and say, well, I would have done this, or I could have done that. Could have taken a right turn or a left turn. Could have gone faster or slower. No, I mean, the way to understand history is to accept for what happened, it happened. And you have to learn from that, and then you have to engage the moment that you're in. Mandela. They took Mandela out, showed him the country, and they said to him, now look, we're going to let you go, but there's a deal. You can do certain things, you can't do other things. What would you have done? They gave him 80-20. In other words, they had the 80, you give him the 20. Now, if you were that kind of person, you were a certain age, etc., would you say, okay, fuck it, I'm going to stay in jail? Or would you say, it's a slim chance I can do anything, I'm going to take it. I'm going to give it a shot. You could say, well, it ended up with Zuma, this asshole. And now you get the guy who is a, what? A lawyer who used to be with COSATU, the head of the trade union. Now he's a multi-millionaire. I don't know, I think I would have done what Mandela did. I would have taken a shot. Now the problem is that the ANC and the CP of South Africa are part of the deal with global capital. And so the class struggle in South Africa now is developing. So there's a whole new movement of workers, a whole new organization other than COSATU that's developing. They're the homeless, the group called the shack dwellers, that are fighting the ANC. So in other words, it's like my response. The dialectic is at work. So Mandela gets out, the ANC and the CP become aligned with the, and become corrupted, okay? And people are dollaring up in the state. And then what? The workers are developing a new front. Now, who would have said, you know, that Mandela shouldn't have come out? You have to put yourself in that situation. I can't say he made a mistake. I mean, we saw it immediately because when Mandela came to the United States, he was speaking in Harlem, and Alam made break, and a bunch of people got with him and saying, why are you not dealing with the land question? Why are you not immediately taking the land back. And Mandela's position was, first of all, that wasn't part of the deal, I accepted. And second of all, he was saying, we're trying to prevent war that would end up massacring people. And so we're trying to work with the system because we have, I mean, Conte Wesizwe, the army was there, but it was really small detachments fighting. They couldn't really resist the South African army. So anyway, my point is that the dialectic continues. And so today, you can actually go online and you can see the class struggle fighting in South Africa. The people of South Africa haven't stopped. The people in China haven't stopped. The people in Cuba are going to continue to fight on, even when the '59 generation is gone. And they have tourism, enclave tourism, and, you know, McDonald's is going to be in Havana. I hate to announce that, but just wait until it happens. They're going to fight against that. Let's see. What about you?
Well, I wanted to raise a question, actually. You mentioned, like, the October Revolution as, like, a positive example to be followed. And you were talking about the emergence of the Soviets as, like, political power of proletarian socialism as opposed to the bourgeois democrats in the provisional government. But something interesting about 1917 is that an October Revolution was necessary, that in February power was ceded to the provisional government, and that there was this role that the party played in providing this historical consciousness of the role of the Soviets in the revolution, pointing back to 1905. And so this kind of relates actually to a question that was raised about the party earlier, because you were talking about political education through political object lessons. And so it seems like the party played that role in this example that you gave of 1917 in October. But in terms of relating generations from the 60s to the 80s, or from the 80s to today, because there isn't a party, it seems as though it's difficult to link up these different experiences, or to even understand them as part of the same struggle. And so, yeah, I mean, so to the extent to which we could entertain that there has been advances, are they advances in the struggle for socialism, or what are they advances in? I don't know if this makes sense as a question, but do you follow me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
See, I would say that it's important to read that little essay by Lenin called Where to Begin. Because what he argued was that what we needed to do was to have worker correspondents on every battlefront and every factory begin to write about their experience and share that, so that from a very particular experience you could begin to generalize toward class consciousness. And also that experience of writing and being in a collective is a step toward organization. So both consciousness and organization comes out of that kind of level of experience. And I think that's really what I was arguing about, what People's College did and what the task is today. If, for example, say 2 or 3 of you all at the University of Chicago were to anchor yourselves in a particular battlefront and go deeply into studying it and interviewing people and gathering data and then feeding that back, because those clips, we published that and fed that back into the actual struggle. And some people said, oh, they ain't nothing but clips. And next week they came around and said, you got another copy of that? Because that was memory that could be lost. You know what the lifespan of an article is. I mean, it's yesterday and then it's gone. But we have articles in there. We got a little article in there where John Johnson of Ebony is giving money to other people other than Harold. You know, I mean, we were holding people accountable by just collecting all this information. So feeding that back And also, there was a journal that was put out at the University of Illinois called the Journal of Common Sense. It was just paragraphs, etc., by these essentially women in working class West Side neighborhood. So cadre, that is young, advanced people who have some idea about socialism, which is an abstraction. Socialism is an abstraction. The objective reality is what actually policies are put into place. So what is the abstraction? Workers control the society. I mean, whatever words you want to use to describe socialism, you still have to objectively work that down into policies that can be implemented and sustained. And so, but to do that, you have to have working class people with that concept, that abstraction, as well as the practical reality of what steps you're taking. So I take your point that we don't have a party, but I would argue that that simply gives us greater freedom and greater responsibility to begin the process. And it's a long march. Now some people would argue it's not a party, it's a social movement. They want to take sort of the Latin American frame of reference. We need social movement. Again, these are words. Because if you have a social movement, you need what? A staff. You need cadre. That is to say, people who are advanced in their thinking, who are disciplined in their organizational skills. Hell, you need cadre if you're running somebody for city council. So cadre, but cadre have to be rooted in the struggle. And that's really the whole thing about the left. You can't be outside of the actual struggles taking place in your lifetime. It's not a book that's important. It's the people that are important. And only by that can you then use the book. Because I'm not saying the book isn't important. The book is very important. But what's principle? Is the book principle or the people principle? And the people have to be principled. If not, fuck, I mean, you know, there's something called, what is it called? Legal Marxism? Marxism in the classroom? You know, academic Marxism? You know, that's why Marx, what did he say? I'm not a Marxist. Yeah.
Maybe to turn it around a little bit, like when you were saying people and book, I was reminded of the distinction between movement and goal. So I understand how, you know, Platypus or some tendencies on the left could appear to be, you know, legal Marxism. Indeed, like Platypus doesn't claim to be political, but what you're describing, you know, in other words, it claims only an educational task itself. But I'm curious, like, then how you think about Edward Bernstein in the Second International, saying the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, and the way that Lenin, Luxemburg, you know, the whole basis of the Third International was precisely a rejection of that conception. So I wonder what you think about that. Like, do you think that's a concern, like, based on?
Oh, it's a very real concern. I mean, in other words, I'm for reform, I'm not for reformism. And what you're describing is reformism. Right? In other words, look, I grew up in a working class household. My father would come home from working in a steel mill, working with fine things. He would put his hands in boiling water to open up his pores so the damn metal would get out of his skin. I'm for reform. You know, I mean, I'm for people being able to eat. I'm for people being able to have heat in the winter. I'm for people being able to have clean clothes. You know, I'm for people having all those things that a lot of people are denied. It's sort of like this, the environmental struggle. We're all for a good environment. But you know what working class people in the South are dealing with? Raw sewage in their front yard. That's the environmental struggle they're dealing with. They're not dealing with the theoretical question of when are we going to lose the islands? At what point will another ½ degree flood the East Coast and the West Coast? Those are real questions. No question about that. But it's different than having doo-doo in your front yard. And so when you actually take the point of view of the working class, reforms are essential. In fact, your ideas mean nothing unless you're connected to those actual reform struggles, unless, of course, you think you are the revolution. Now, so reformism. So when I say, books are people, see, the dialectic is the unity of those opposites. The question is, what's principle? So if people are principle, that doesn't mean, it's sort of like this. You go into a hospital. You're in the emergency room, right? They do triage. Your nose is running. You've got a broken toe. And you have intestinal bleeding. The first thing they do is they say, the first thing we want to know is, what symptom do you have that is going to kill you in the next hour? We're going to address that first. And then we're going to deal with the rest. Now, some of those other things might kill you too, but not in the next hour. And so when you deal with the people, of course you have the goal, and of course you have all kinds of ideas, etc., and of course you have the history of all revolutions, right? But if you don't respect the working class and people that you exist with contemporaneously in your society, then those ideas don't mean anything. That's why I say classroom, or go to another country, or look in a mirror and think you're all that important. But the actual reality is going on in the society independent of that. And if you are living in any community, you should go out and live in a community. You know what Robert Park and them did in the Department of Sociology here to teach urban sociology? The first thing they did was they had a couple of weeks in the seminar, and then they sent everybody out to a community. Because these professors were actually the children of ministers from rural areas. And so the city was something new to them. And so they would say, okay, go out and get yourself a block and learn about, talk to everybody on the block, find out what their life is all about, etc., etc. And then you can begin to understand when we talk about urban sociology. Well, if you're interested in changing the society, you better go out and get involved in something. Get with a political campaign. Even if you don't like what's going on, you will learn what a political campaign is. And people who say they don't want to do that, then I say, why are you at the University of Chicago? This is a system of evil. This isn't a liberatory institution. This is an institution designed, well, they got an institute here for Becker. What's his name? That whole struggle. I mean, this place here is but you can get from here. It's just like in a guerrilla struggle. You got to take the weapons from the oppressor. That's how you get guns. You ain't got no gun factory. So if you need education and knowledge and you need to sharpen your mind, you can do it here. But you have to have a purpose. You have to not to serve them. You have to have a purpose. And I would just say this last thing. If I was doing it again, and I swore I was going to do this, and I haven't, I'd learn Spanish if I were you. Because that connection is what's going to save not only this city, but this country. But if we don't have that connection, then people are still going to be strangers to each other. And one of the things that, I know I'm particularly concerned with is helping the Latinos understand that they are not white people. You know what I mean? They might not all think they're African, but they are not white people. In fact, the conquistadores and those people that came from Spain, something happened to them over the generations. Yeah.
Sorry, I think that could you just clarify what reformism is?
Yes. Reformism is to think that the incremental gains represent the ultimate achievement. And so one continues to go nothing but incremental gains. And so what happens then is you end up legitimating the system as opposed to always having this dialectic of reform and revolution, where you're constantly educating people to the extent as possible about the delegitimating the social relations of the system. And that's why, for example, a lot of people in the political system that we might join their campaign, etc., would be very leery of the left, because ultimately you represent a negation of what they're about. But that's the contradiction you have to live with. And sometimes you have to shut up, you know, and not just blabber on about, you know, the revolutionary goal, right? Because